The rise and legacy of Empress Theodora. On a sweltering summer morning in 532 AD, as Constantinople burned and the mob howled for Emperor Justinian's head, every powerful man in the room urged their ruler to flee. The empire was crumbling, they insisted, and death awaited anyone foolish enough to stay. But then a woman's voice cut through the panic, clear, sharp, and laced with steel. "Those who wear the crown," she declared, "should never survive its loss." The men fell silent. Their emperor straightened his spine, and in that moment, the course of history pivoted on the words of a former actress and daughter of a bear keeper who had clawed her way from the circus floor to the imperial throne. This is not merely the story of how a prostitute became an empress, though that alone would be worth telling. This is the tale of how the most brilliant mind of the 6th century orchestrated a complete reinvention of an empire, outsmarted 3 different emperors, rewrote Roman law to protect society's most vulnerable, and built a spy network so effective that even the Pope's private prayers reached her ears before sunset. Theodora didn't just survive in a world engineered to destroy women like her. She mastered it, remade it, and ruled it, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the millennia. And it all began with a little girl standing in the shadows of the Hippodrome, watching the power players above her and learning how to play a game they didn't even know they were teaching her. The rise of Theodora, from bearkeeper's daughter to power broker. The bears were restless that morning. Acacius knew their moods better than he knew his own children's, the way they paced when a storm was coming, how they grew quiet before an earthquake. But today, they prowled their cages with a new kind of tension, and his youngest daughter watched them with the same unsettling intensity. 3-year-old Theodora pressed her face against the wooden bars, fearless even as the largest bear swung its massive head toward her. "They're not angry, Papa," she announced with the certainty only a child could muster. "They're bored. Like the senators in their boxes." The Hippodrome of Constantinople was a world unto itself, a roaring universe of 20,000 souls compressed into stepped marble seats that rose like a tidal wave around the massive oval arena. Here, fortunes were won and lost between breakfast and dinner. Emperors were made and unmade between sunrise and sunset. And a man who kept the bears could earn more in tips than a philosopher earned in a month. Acacius had worked his way up from cleaning animal waste to becoming the master of the bear pits, a position that earned him the right to wear a green sash and sit in the faction's special seats. But more importantly, it earned him the right to bring his daughters into the backstage warren of the Hippodrome, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers where power in the Eastern Roman Empire truly resided. While her sisters played with dolls made from corn husks and dreamed of marriages to soldiers, young Theodora was studying a different kind of warfare. She learned to read an audience before she learned to read words, to gauge the mood of a crowd the way her father gauged his bears. From her perch in the shadows beneath the emperor's box, she watched how the circus faction leaders manipulated the masses, how a single gesture could turn cheers to riots, how the real show had nothing to do with the races or fights in the arena, and everything to do with the invisible currents of power flowing through the crowd. But the Hippodrome, like fate itself, was a fickle master. When Theodora was 7, a new bear arrived, a massive beast from the Caucasus Mountains with eyes like amber and a temper as sharp as its claws. Acacius approached it with the same confident grace he'd shown 1,000 times before. He never saw the rotted plank that would splinter beneath his foot, never heard his daughter's scream of warning. By sunset, the Green faction had a new bear-keeper, and Theodora's family had nothing but her father's blood-stained sash and debts that would have made a merchant prince blanch. Her mother tried everything proper women were supposed to do, sewing, begging relatives for help, even attempting to sell their father's position to another animal handler. But proper behavior meant starvation in 6th century Constantinople. On the morning Theodora turned 8, she wrapped her father's green sash around her waist, marched into the Hippodrome's main office, and announced to the faction manager that she was reporting for work. He laughed until she started describing every secret deal she'd witnessed from her hiding spots, every whispered conversation she'd memorized, every weakness she'd observed in his regional competitors. By sunset, she had a job as a stage sweeper, and her first lesson in real power was complete. Knowledge, properly wielded, could bend even the most rigid social barriers. But sweeping stages would only keep her family fed for so long. As she watched the actresses who commanded the Hippodrome's smaller stages between chariot races, Theodora began to see a path forward. These women weren't just performers. They were power brokers, confidants to the mighty wielders of secrets and influence. Their costumes might be cheap gilt and painted leather, but they moved with the confidence of queens. And unlike queens, they answered to no one but themselves. One such actress, noting the intense young girl who seemed to absorb every gesture and inflection, offered to teach her the art of performance. What she actually taught Theodora was something far more valuable: how to turn every conversation into a stage, every interaction into a performance, and every secret into a weapon. The daughter of the bear keeper was about to step into the spotlight, and Constantinople would never be the same. Theodora, from stage to power. By age 14, Theodora had mastered the art of making powerful men believe they were clever. It was a skill worth more than gold in the Byzantine entertainment world, where every performance was also an audition for patronage. While other actresses fought for center stage, she cultivated the far more valuable territory in the wings, the shadowed spaces where generals whispered state secrets to courtesans and drunk officials, bragged about tomorrow's policy changes. The Hippodrome's afternoon shows became her laboratory for human nature. She developed a signature style of wit that could flay a heckler alive while making the rest of the audience feel like co-conspirators in the kill. Her specialty was political satire, dangerous territory in an empire where a misplaced joke could lead to a midnight visit from the palace guard. But Theodora had learned that the trick to mocking the powerful was to make them believe they were in on the joke. She would catch the eye of the highest-ranking official in attendance, give him a conspiratorial wink, and suddenly her barbs about corrupt tax collectors seemed to be commentary about his rivals rather than his own operations. Her greatest performance, however, took place far from any stage. On a sweltering afternoon, as she prepared for her act, a palace eunuch arrived with an imperial summons. Emperor Justinian, it seemed, had heard rumors of her wit and wanted a private performance. Any other actress would have seen this as the opportunity of a lifetime. Theodora saw the trap it was. Instead of rushing to the palace, she sent back a message that would become legendary in Constantinople's theatrical circles. Tell His Imperial Majesty that my art, like his justice, belongs to all the people. He is welcome to attend tomorrow's public performance, where he can judge my talents alongside his subjects. The audience the next day included not only Emperor Justinian, but half the imperial court, all expecting to see this audacious actress stumble. Instead, they witnessed a masterclass in power dynamics. Theodora's performance wove together threads of classical philosophy, street humor, and subtle political commentary so deftly that each member of the audience could find exactly what they wanted to see. The nobles heard sophistication, the common people heard truth-telling, and the emperor heard something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine wit without sycophancy. But it was Justin's nephew, Justinian, who truly understood what he was watching. While others saw an entertainer, he recognized a mind that could match his own in both ambition and cunning. He began attending her performances regularly, always sitting in the shadows, watching how she could turn a crowd of strangers into a unified force with nothing but words and timing. What fascinated him wasn't her beauty. Constantinople had beautiful women in abundance. It was the way she could read a room's power dynamics faster than his best strategic advisors. The theatrical world began to feel like a cage rather than a stage. Theodora had learned everything it could teach her about human nature, influence, and the art of making people believe what you wanted them to believe. She had built a network of informants that spanned from palace servants to dock workers, each feeding her tidbits of information that she wove into her performances. But she was still just commenting on power rather than wielding it. Then came the night that changed everything. After a particularly successful show, she found a gift in her dressing room, a book of imperial law codes with certain passages marked. The attached note, written in a distinctive hand she would come to know well, asked for her thoughts on potential reforms. It wasn't a love letter. It was something far more intoxicating, an invitation to step beyond observing power and begin shaping it. Within days, she had disappeared from Constantinople, leaving behind a city full of rumors and a very interested future emperor who understood that sometimes the best way to catch a brilliant mind was to give it room to grow. Desert Exile and the Art of Invisible Influence. Alexandria's harbor master noted something unusual about the woman who stepped off the grain ship from Constantinople. While other travelers clutched holy relics or trade goods, she carried a leather satchel full of law codes and theological texts. Her papers identified her as a merchant's widow, but she moved with the calculated grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Within days, she had vanished into the labyrinthine streets of Alexandria's Jewish quarter, where even the emperor's spies feared to tread. The Egyptian port city served as the intellectual crossroads of the 6th century, where strands of Greek philosophy, Hebrew mysticism, Persian astronomy, and Christian doctrine tangled together in ways that would have scandalized Constantinople's Orthodox clergy. Theodora dove into this intellectual maelstrom with the same intensity she had once brought to mastering stagecraft. She found her way to the hidden libraries where Monophysite scholars debated the nature of Christ, and to secret workshops where natural philosophers conducted experiments that walked the thin line between science and sorcery. Her first mentor was Sarah the Alexandrian, a Jewish woman renowned for her knowledge of both medicine and mathematics. While treating Theodora for a persistent fever, Sarah recognized something in the exile's questions that went beyond mere curiosity. Soon, their conversations moved from physical healing to deeper mysteries: the mathematical patterns underlying creation, the ancient Egyptian art of reading character through gesture, the secret languages used by desert hermits to encode their wisdom. But Alexandria's true gift to Theodora wasn't knowledge, it was invisibility. For the first time since childhood, she could move through the world without performing. She learned to listen rather than speak, to observe without being observed. In the city's vast marketplace, she practiced the art of becoming forgettable, of being the kind of person that others would speak freely around without remembering. Her natural dramatic flair gave way to something more powerful, the ability to make others feel like the protagonists of their own stories. The turning point came during a chance encounter at the monastery of St. Catherine. Theodora had gone there to study ancient manuscripts, but found herself witness to a secret meeting between Egyptian religious leaders planning resistance against Constantinople's religious policies. Instead of reporting this seditious gathering to curry favor with the capital, she saw a different opportunity. Over the next months, she began acting as a quiet intermediary between opposing religious factions, learning the art of finding common ground between seemingly irreconcilable positions. Word of her diplomatic skills reached Timothy, the Monophysite patriarch in exile. He recognized in Theodora something rare, a mind that could grasp both theological abstractions and practical politics. Their discussions ranged from the nature of imperial authority to the role of women in spiritual leadership. But his most valuable lesson came in the form of a warning. Power wielded openly, he told her, becomes a target. True influence flows like water under the earth, invisible until it bursts forth as a spring that all men claim they discovered. As her 4th year of exile drew to a close, a letter arrived from Constantinople. Written in that same distinctive hand she remembered, it contained no direct requests or promises, only a series of observations about the empire's growing instability and the need for minds that could bridge divisions rather than deepen them. Theodora understood the implicit invitation. She had entered Alexandria as an actress fleeing the constraints of her past. She would return to Constantinople as something far more dangerous, a woman who had learned to wield influence without seeming to hold power at all. The harbor master who watched her board the ship back to Constantinople noted something curious in his ledger. Unlike most travelers who accumulated possessions during their time in Alexandria, she carried only the same leather satchel she had arrived with. But now, instead of law codes, it contained something far more valuable, a network of contacts spanning every major religious and philosophical movement in the East, and a profound understanding of how to shape events without leaving fingerprints on history. The love story that reshaped an empire. The Constantinople that Theodora returned to had changed. Emperor Justin had grown feeble, and real power now resided with his nephew Justinian, who ruled in all but name. The city buzzed with rumors about the heir apparent, his legendary work ethic, his vision of rebuilding Rome's glory, and his peculiar habit of testing potential advisors with elaborate intellectual puzzles. What nobody expected was his first action upon learning of Theodora's return. He invited her to critique his latest legal reforms. Their initial meeting was supposed to last an hour. Palace records show it stretched to 7. With servants repeatedly dispatched to bring fresh writing materials as the two covered scroll after scroll with legal arguments and counter-arguments. Justinian, who famously slept only 4 hours a night to spend more time working, had finally met someone who could match his intellectual stamina. Theodora, who had spent years learning to hide her brilliance, had finally found someone she didn't have to play dumb for. The court's reaction to their growing partnership was swift and venomous. Anonymous letters appeared in the palace suggesting Theodora was a foreign spy. Old theater rivals spread lurid stories about her past. One morning, she found a dead snake in her chambers, a traditional warning to ambitious women who rose above their station. That afternoon, she wore it as a bracelet to her meeting with Justinian, commenting dryly on how thoughtful someone had been to provide her with a new accessory. But the real opposition came from an unexpected quarter. Justin's wife, Empress Euphemia, had spent years cultivating potential brides from noble families for her nephew. The idea of him marrying an actress, even one who could debate theology with bishops, was unthinkable. More than unthinkable, it was illegal. Ancient Roman law explicitly forbade high officials from marrying actresses. When Justinian began making obvious moves toward marriage, Euphemia deployed her most powerful weapon. She threatened to deny him the throne itself. What happened next demonstrated why this particular love story would reshape an empire. Instead of giving up or giving in, Justinian and Theodora turned their relationship into a test case for their shared vision of legal reform. They argued that the old law against actresses marrying officials had been designed to prevent corruption, not to permanently stigmatize women who had sought economic survival through performance. Theodora herself drafted much of the legal argument, drawing on her time in Alexandria to cite historical precedents where Roman law had evolved to match social realities. The debate split Constantinople's power brokers into two camps. The traditionalists saw it as an assault on social order itself. The pragmatists, noting how effectively the couple worked together, began to wonder if such a partnership might be exactly what the empire needed. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source: the common people. Every time Theodora walked through the city, crowds gathered to cheer the woman who had risen from nothing through wit and will alone. Street performers began putting on skits about love triumphing over outdated laws. The public support became so overwhelming that maintaining the marriage ban began to look more politically dangerous than abolishing it. Justin, in one of his last lucid acts as emperor, signed the law that changed the definition of who could marry whom. The official reason cited dry legal precedents. The real reason could be seen in the way his nephew looked at the woman who had given up everything she had built in Alexandria to return to a city that had once driven her into exile. Their wedding was a statement in itself, not a grand public spectacle, but an intimate ceremony focused on the legal and spiritual aspects of their union. That night, as the celebration continued in the palace, the newly married couple slipped away to Justinian's private library. There, surrounded by the law books and reforms they had already begun drafting together, they worked until dawn on their shared vision for the empire. It was perhaps the most romantic thing either of them could imagine, the chance to transform the world's greatest empire, together. Theodora's mastery of power and secrets in Byzantine Constantinople. Power in 6th century Constantinople flowed through whispers. While Justinian worked openly to reform laws and rebuild monuments, Theodora created something unprecedented: an intelligence network that turned the palace's marble halls into a web of carefully harvested secrets. Her first recruit wasn't a spy at all, but a mathematician from Alexandria who could encode messages in seemingly innocent letters about household accounts. Within months, every piece of gossip, every financial secret, and every political scheme in the capital passed through a complex system of analysis before reaching her private study. The ghost of her father's death had taught her to trust systems over individuals. Each informant knew only their small part of the operation, reporting to handlers who reported to other handlers, creating layers of separation between information gathering and the Empress herself. She turned the palace's eunuchs from marginalized servants into her elite core of analysts, knowing their isolation from traditional power structures made them ideal cultivators of secrets. They became known as the Empress's Shadows, though few understood just how apt that nickname was. Her masterpiece of political architecture came in the form of what appeared to be a simple social innovation: the Empress's afternoon salon. Every day, she hosted gatherings where noble women could speak freely about their concerns. To the public, it seemed like nothing more than a generous gesture toward previously ignored wives of powerful men. In reality, she had created a phenomenon that would transform Byzantine politics, a parallel power structure where women who overheard their husbands' secrets could trade information for influence. But Theodora's true genius lay not in gathering intelligence, but in how she wielded it. When she discovered a plot against a rising general named Belisarius, she didn't expose the conspirators. Instead, she arranged for their wives to receive invitations to exclusive shopping trips with merchants from China. The plotters, suddenly finding their families benefiting from imperial favor, abandoned their scheme without Theodora having to issue a single threat. The general never knew he had been saved, which was exactly how Theodora preferred to operate. Her methods proved their worth during the Silk Crisis. When Chinese merchants began charging extortionate prices for raw silk, threatening Constantinople's crucial textile industry, Theodora's network discovered something fascinating. 2 Christian monks who had traveled to China had learned the closely guarded secret of silk production. While other advisors suggested military action to secure trade routes, Theodora orchestrated an elaborate operation to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China inside hollow walking sticks. The monks were officially traveling on a religious mission. Unofficially, they were laying the groundwork for Byzantine silk independence. Not all her victories were bloodless. When she uncovered evidence that the palace chamberlain was selling access to Justinian's private schedule to foreign ambassadors, she arranged a scene of devastating public humiliation. During a crowded court ceremony, she casually mentioned details from his supposedly secret meetings, watching as he realized that his own network had been compromised. By sunset, he had fled the city, leaving behind a warning to others who might consider betraying imperial trust. The empire's enemies soon learned to fear the seemingly omniscient empress more than her husband's armies. Foreign ambassadors discovered that she knew their instructions before they delivered them. Corrupt officials found their schemes unraveling before they could implement them. Even the church hierarchy learned that their private debates somehow reached the palace with supernatural speed. A Persian diplomat, frustrated after a particularly difficult negotiation, was heard to remark, "We can field armies against their generals, but how do you fight someone who can hear your whispers across the sea?" Yet for all her mastery of shadows, Theodora never forgot the lessons of the stage. She understood that power required not just control of information, but control of narratives. Every calculated act of mercy, every public display of piety, every carefully chosen word in public fed into the image she crafted, not just an empress, but an avatar of divine wisdom. The purple curtain behind her throne became famous. Petitioners would approach it, state their case, and receive answers from the unseen empress. None of them knew that the curtain's real purpose was to let her read reports and dispatch orders while maintaining the illusion of undivided attention. But even as she built this intricate machinery of power, signals began reaching her network of something that would test all her skills at once. A crisis was brewing in the streets, one that would threaten not just her position, but the empire itself. The Nika riots, Theodora's finest hour. The morning Constantinople began to burn. Theodora was reading intelligence reports about grain shipments. The first warning came not from the streets, but from an unexpected pattern. Every baker in the Blue Quarter had bought enough flour for 3 days, not their usual daily purchase. Someone was expecting trouble. By the time the first shouts of Nika, victory, echoed through the streets, she had already ordered the palace guards to their emergency positions. What began as a typical circus faction riot transformed into something unprecedented. Blues and Greens' traditional enemies who had been brawling for generations suddenly united against imperial authority. Theodora's network of informants reported the impossible: secret meetings between faction leaders who had previously sworn blood feuds against each other. This wasn't spontaneous anger, it was orchestrated insurrection. The city descended into chaos with theatrical precision. Fires sprouted in a pattern that drove refugees toward the Hippodrome, where clever agitators turned fear into rage. Prison doors mysteriously opened. Weapons appeared in the hands of civilians. Theodora recognized the choreography. She had once staged similar scenes for dramatic effect. But this was no theater, and the smoke rising from the burning buildings was all too real. By the 5th day, the rioters had proclaimed a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of a former emperor, in a ceremony that mixed mob violence with ancient tradition. The crowd size swelled to over 100,000, and the chants of Nika became a constant roar that shook the palace windows. Even the palace guard began wavering, their loyalty buckling under the weight of the crowd's certainty that they were witnessing the end of Justinian's reign. Inside the palace's Chrysotraclinos, golden audience chamber, the empire's leadership fractured. General Belisarius advocated fighting their way to the harbor. The imperial treasurer was already negotiating with ship captains for escape. Justinian, exhausted from days without sleep, listened as his advisors painted increasingly dire scenarios of defeat and death. Then Theodora stepped forward. The chronicler Procopius records that the chamber fell silent as she began to speak, though the roar of the mob could still be heard through the windows. Her words would be carved into history. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Never will I see the day when I am not saluted as Empress. If you wish to save yourself, my lord, nothing is easier. We are rich, there is the sea, there are the ships. Yet reflect for a moment whether, when you have once escaped to a place of security, you would not gladly exchange such safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that the royal purple is the noblest of burial shrouds. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Justinian's chair scraping back. Those who witnessed the moment said the transformation was visible, from a hunted man considering flight to an emperor ready to fight. Theodora had given him back his throne with words alone, but now came the harder part: saving an empire armed with nothing but wit and will. Her strategy unfolded like a master player's endgame. First, she dispatched agents to spread rumors that the Persians were approaching the city's eastern borders, knowing this would send many of the more cautious rioters hurrying home to protect their families. Then she authorized her network of merchants to sell wine at massive discounts, ensuring that by nightfall, many of the mob's most aggressive members would be too drunk to fight effectively. The masterstroke came in her handling of Hypatius, the mob's chosen emperor. Instead of treating him as an enemy, she sent him a secret message that appeared to come from his own supporters, urging him to lead the entire crowd into the Hippodrome for a formal coronation. It was a brilliant trap. Once the mob was contained within the arena's walls, Belisarius's troops, who had been quietly assembled in the tunnels beneath the structure, emerged to block all exits. What followed was simultaneously a massacre and a miracle. The official death count reached 30,000, but the empire survived. Hypatius and his key supporters were executed, not in public, but quietly in the palace dungeons. The next morning, Theodora ordered the city's bakers to distribute free bread, while Justinian announced a massive reconstruction project that would employ thousands of the rioters' neighbors. The message was clear: defiance would be crushed, but loyalty would be rewarded. As the smoke cleared from Constantinople's skyline, those who survived understood that they had witnessed not just the preservation of an empire, but the revelation of its true sovereign. Justinian might wear the crown, but it was Theodora who had proven herself willing to die for it, and more importantly, knew exactly how to ensure she wouldn't have to. The real power behind the throne, Theodora's legacy of influence and reform. History is written in laws as much as battles. While Justinian's military campaigns drew the world's attention, Theodora initiated a legal revolution that would outlive them both. Her first target was the law of consent, the radical notion that a woman's agreement should be required for her own marriage. The assembled legal scholars blanched at such an unprecedented concept until Theodora quietly reminded them of their own wives and daughters. The law passed unanimously. The true genius of her reforms lay in their presentation. Each radical change was wrapped in traditional language, attributed to ancient precedents that she had her scholars discover in conveniently fragmentary texts. When she outlawed forced prostitution, it was framed as a restoration of Constantine's moral policies. When she granted mothers guardianship rights over their children, previously unthinkable in Roman law, it was presented as a clarification of ancient practice rather than the revolution it really was. Her most ambitious project transformed the Eastern Church's power structure through subtle manipulation of theological debates. During the Monophysite controversy, she positioned herself as the protector of persecuted monks while simultaneously funding Orthodox monasteries, creating a web of obligation that crossed theological lines. When rival religious factions threatened to tear the empire apart, she established a network of hospitals and poorhouses that forced competing clergy to work together or lose access to imperial funding. The construction of the Hagia Sophia became her masterpiece of political theater. While Justinian saw it as a monument to divine glory, Theodora recognized its potential as a stage for power. She insisted on adding galleries where women could worship separately from men, galleries that happened to offer perfect vantage points for her agents to observe the congregation below. The building's acoustics were designed so that a whisper from certain points could be heard clearly at others, creating what she called her architecture of information. Her influence extended far beyond Constantinople's walls. She planted agents in every major court from Persia to Francia, creating what modern historians would call the first international intelligence network. When the Persian Shah bragged about secret military preparations, Theodora's dinner conversation casually referenced details of his plans that his own wife didn't know. The message was clear: distance was no barrier to her reach. But her most effective weapon remained theater. During crucial diplomatic negotiations, she would arrange for foreign ambassadors to accidentally witness carefully staged scenes, a kindness to a poor petitioner, a moment of religious devotion, a display of startling military intelligence. Each performance added to the carefully cultivated myth of an empress blessed with divine insight. As one African diplomat wrote home, "She knows your thoughts before you think them, and has answered your question before you ask it." The empire's gold flowed through channels she designed, funding a system of granaries, aqueducts, and harbors that made charity serve strategic purposes. When famine struck Syria, her relief efforts came with subtle diplomatic strings attached. Each gift of grain carried the message that Constantinople's Empress could provide what local leaders could not. She transformed traditional feminine virtues like mercy and charity into tools of imperial power. Yet power, as Theodora well knew, was always a performance. In private moments recorded by her personal secretary, she spoke of building something that would outlast her, a framework of laws and institutions that would constrain the worst impulses of future rulers. She was creating a new kind of empire, one where power flowed not just from the sword and crown, but from networks of influence and webs of mutual obligation. As she told her closest advisors, men think power sits on a throne, wrapped in purple. They don't see that real power moves like light through water, invisible until it illuminates everything it touches. The empire was her stage now, and every law, every policy, every diplomatic triumph was part of a performance designed to outlive its performer. The price of power. The life and burden of Empress Theodora. The Empress's private chambers held a secret. Behind screens of Tyrian purple silk, past the guards and attendants, through a door known to only 3 people in the empire, lay a small room with bare walls. Here, records show, Theodora would sometimes spend hours alone, seated on a simple wooden bench identical to the one she had used in her acting days. It was the only space in Constantinople where she allowed herself to be simply Theodora rather than Augusta, Empress of the Romans. Power extracted its price in moments rather than coin. When her sister Comito fell ill, protocol demanded that the Empress couldn't risk infection by visiting her sickbed. Theodora sent the empire's finest physicians but couldn't hold her sister's hand as she died. In her private journal, found centuries later in a monastery archive, she wrote, "The crown protects everything except what matters most." Her relationship with Justinian evolved into something more complex than marriage. They became partners in an elaborate dance of power, each playing their role with such precision that even their closest advisors couldn't tell where one's influence ended and the other's began. But there were costs to this perfect partnership. Their personal moments together grew rare, sacrificed to the endless demands of empire. As she noted in a letter to her childhood friend Marina, "We have created something greater than ourselves, and now we must serve it." The burden of omniscience wore heavily. Her intelligence network brought her knowledge of every plot, every betrayal, every human weakness in the empire. She learned of her own nephew's involvement in a conspiracy against the throne. The law demanded death for treason. She arranged instead for him to take holy orders at a distant monastery, but the message to other relatives was clear. Blood ties meant nothing compared to imperial security. Even her charities became weapons she couldn't put down. When she established a safe house for women fleeing abuse, it quickly became a vital source of information about powerful families' private lives. The women she helped would gratefully share their husbands' secrets, never realizing they were contributing to the Empress's intelligence gathering. Theodora used this information to force legal reforms protecting women, but each piece of leverage gained came with the bitter taste of exploiting those she meant to save. Sleep became her rarest commodity. Her agents worked in shifts around the clock, but she personally reviewed their most critical reports. Palace servants reported hearing her pace her chambers at midnight, dictating responses to crises in distant provinces. She developed the habit of catnapping during the day, training herself to wake instantly alert. The court physician secretly noted his concerns about her exhaustion, but never dared voice them. Perhaps the heaviest burden was the constant performance. Every public appearance had to be perfect, every word precisely chosen. A single misstep could unravel years of carefully crafted authority. She created an elaborate system of signals with her handmaidens. A touched earring meant she needed rescue from a conversation. A shifted ring indicated a person to be watched. The strain of maintaining such control showed only in private, in moments when she thought herself unobserved. Her daughter, Arabia, grew up watching this impossible balancing act. In a preserved fragment of her diary, she wrote, "Mother's true genius isn't in knowing everything. It's in bearing the weight of knowing." The girl learned early that sharing her mother's blood meant sharing her mother's burden of constant vigilance. When Arabia showed interest in a young nobleman, Theodora had his entire family investigated before allowing even a chaperoned meeting. The greatest irony came in the realm of friendship. The woman who had built an empire on networks of relationship found herself increasingly isolated by her own power. Those who had known her before her rise either wanted favors or feared her too much for honesty. New acquaintances were impossible. Everyone at court had an agenda. She solved this by creating a position unknown in imperial history, the court truth-teller, an official granted immunity to speak freely to the Empress, even if it meant criticism. In her final years, Theodora wrote a private manual for future empresses, discovered centuries later in a sealed vault. Its most poignant passage reads, "Power is not the crown you wear, but the crown that wears you." Each morning you must choose, be the hammer or the anvil. I chose to be the hammer, knowing it would chip away at my own heart with every strike. This is the price. Pay it willingly, or power will take it from you anyway. Theodora, a legacy beyond empire. When the last traces of Roman power faded from the West, Theodora's fingerprints remained pressed into the foundation of civilization itself. Her influence outlived not just her era, but the entire Byzantine Empire. In the law schools of medieval Bologna, students still studied the Corpus Juris Civilis, debating legal principles she had crafted in midnight sessions. None of them knew that the most revolutionary elements, particularly those regarding women's rights, had sprung from the mind of an actress turned empress. Her architectural innovation of separate women's galleries in the Hagia Sophia spawned a revolution in sacred architecture. From Moscow to Ethiopia, churches incorporated what became known as Theodora's wisdom, spaces where women could participate in public life while maintaining social propriety. These galleries often served their original dual purpose: sanctuaries for worship and perfect vantage points for observation. The diplomatic corps she created became the template for modern statecraft. Her system of permanent ambassadors, maintained through both war and peace, was rediscovered by Renaissance Venice. The Venetians built their legendary intelligence network on principles laid out in a fragmentary manual attributed to Theodora's personal spy master. When the first modern diplomatic services emerged, they unconsciously replicated patterns she had established 9 centuries earlier. Perhaps her most subtle legacy lay in the art of information management. The medieval Islamic world preserved her innovations in coded communication and network organization. The Abbasid Caliphate's administrative system bore striking similarities to her model of layered intelligence gathering. When scholars finally gained access to both Byzantine and Arabic sources, they discovered that many techniques credited to later rulers had originated in Theodora's private chancellery. Her influence surfaced in unexpected places. When Eleanor of Aquitaine established her court of love in medieval France, she was consciously modeling it on accounts of Theodora's women's salon. The tradition of powerful women maintaining parallel power structures through social gatherings could be traced directly back to those afternoon meetings in Constantinople's Purple Chambers. The great irony of Theodora's legacy was that her most successful innovations were the ones history forgot to credit her for. The principle that imperial power should be exercised through institutions rather than individuals became so fundamental that its revolutionary nature was forgotten. Her system of using charitable institutions as instruments of state policy became standard practice throughout medieval Europe. In the Orthodox Church, despite official attempts to minimize her role, Theodora's influence proved indelible. The principle she established, that religious authority must be balanced against practical governance, shaped Eastern Christianity's relationship with political power for a millennium. The title she created, equal to the Apostles, originally a diplomatic tool for managing religious disputes, became one of the highest honors the Orthodox Church could bestow. Yet her most enduring legacy wasn't in institutions or laws, but in the stories people told about her. In the markets of medieval Constantinople, mothers would tell their daughters to be like Theodora, not the Empress, but the clever girl who had transformed herself through wit and will. In Armenian folk tales, she appeared as a wise woman who could see through any deception. Persian chronicles credited her with almost supernatural political insight. Centuries after her death, when archaeologists excavated the foundations of her great projects, they discovered something remarkable. Under the cornerstone of each major building, they found small bronze theater masks. Some historians argued they were pagan talismans that had survived the empire's Christianization. Others recognized the truth. They were Theodora's signature, a reminder that all power is ultimately performance, and that the greatest performances are the ones that transform their audience forever. Her final gift to history was hidden in plain sight. In the Hagia Sophia, high above the emperor's traditional position, her mosaic portrait still watches over the space she transformed. Unlike traditional imperial images, she looks not at the viewer but slightly past, as if seeing something in the distance. Perhaps she was looking toward the future she helped create, a world where power could flow through law as well as force, where ability could triumph over birth, and where even the daughter of a bear keeper could reshape an empire. As a modern historian noted, standing beneath that same mosaic, Theodora's greatest achievement wasn't that she changed history. It's that she changed what people believed was possible. The Echo of Theodora, a legacy of power and insight. On a crisp morning in modern Istanbul, tourists queue to enter the Hagia Sophia, unaware they're following exactly the same path that 6th century supplicants took to seek Theodora's judgment. The massive doors still swing on their original hinges, each creak an echo of another age. Above, her mosaic faces east, not towards Constantinople's past glory, but towards the rising sun of futures she imagined. In 2020, when the Hagia Sophia was converted back into a mosque, the caretakers faced an unprecedented dilemma. Islamic tradition required covering figurative art during prayers, but historians insisted Theodora's mosaic must be preserved. The solution came from an unexpected source, her own writings about religious compromise. Following her principle of practical accommodation, engineers designed a system of curtains that could shield the mosaic during prayers while leaving it visible at other times. Even 14 centuries after her death, Theodora was still solving religious disputes. Her influence appears in startling places. When the United Nations drafted its conventions on women's rights, researchers discovered that some of their most progressive provisions had precedence in her legal reforms. The World Bank's studies on using charitable institutions for economic development unconsciously echo her strategies. Modern intelligence agencies still study her network structure, marveling at how she solved problems they face with digital surveillance through human insight alone. In the marble halls of the European Court of Human Rights, a principle called Theodora's Rule is still invoked in cases involving personal autonomy. Though few of the judges know its origin, they're applying her revolutionary idea that law should protect the powerless from the powerful, not the other way around. When the court ruled on human trafficking in 2023, they cited legal principles she had established to protect vulnerable women, proving that well-crafted laws can reach across millennia to deliver justice. Perhaps her most relevant legacy for our time is her understanding of information as power. In an age of digital networks and viral content, her insights about controlling narratives while appearing to merely observe them feel startlingly modern. Social media influencers unknowingly employ techniques she developed for managing public perception. Political strategists study her methods of turning social networks into power structures. The final joke would have delighted her. In the end, history remembered exactly what she wanted it to remember, while forgetting precisely what she hoped it would forget. We remember the laws, the buildings, the institutions, all the things she created to outlast herself. The secret mechanisms, the hidden levers of power, the intimate cost of wielding authority, these faded like footprints in sand, just as she intended. Standing beneath her mosaic today, visitors often report a strange sensation. From certain angles and certain lights, her eyes seem to follow you with a knowing expression. It's as if she's still watching, still calculating, still seeing possibilities that others miss. In that timeless gaze lies perhaps her greatest lesson. True power isn't about controlling the present, but about shaping the future in ways that echo long after we're gone. A young girl visits the Hagia Sophia with her school class, looks up at that same mosaic, and asks her teacher a question that would have made Theodora smile. How did she know what people centuries later would need? The answer, of course, is that she didn't. She simply understood that the most enduring form of power isn't force or wealth or even law. It's the ability to change how people imagine what's possible. The echo of her sandals still rings through history's halls. Each time a woman rises to power against impossible odds, each time law triumphs over force, each time wit and will overcome rigid tradition, Theodora's shadow lengthens. She taught us that true revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and armies. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing purple sandals, armed with nothing but insight and determination, ready to reshape the world one whispered word at a time.